Narcissistic relationships are basically just defensive dances. You trying to, usually failing, but you defending yourself from accusations that often don't make sense or just never end, or criticisms that seem unrelenting, and them, the narcissist, constantly defending themselves to protect their fragility. So today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is chocolate cake. You're like, chocolate cake? Where is this going? Well, it's really going to go to a very pointed conversation about narcissism. So it's a little bit of a bummer that something as wonderful as chocolate cake has to be associated with something that is as difficult as narcissistic relationships. But here we are. Dr. W. Keith Campbell put forth the chocolate cake model to understand why people get into narcissistic relationships. It's a simple but elegant model. And for those of you who like to geek out on scholarly research about narcissism, look up Campbell's work. He's a rock star. His research on narcissism is really fantastic and certainly has been very formative for me. But the chocolate cake model, it's exactly what you think. Most people would rather eat chocolate cake than a bowl of broccoli. Let's face it, chocolate cake is more appealing, tasty, and gratifying in the short term, and it feels so good, right? But unlike that bowl of broccoli, pretty soon after you eat it, you regret it. If you eat too much chocolate cake, you'll gain weight. It can take a toll on your health. Heck, even within an hour of eating it, you might have a sugar crash and then still be hungry, leaving you craving for something more. Now, Campbell's argument is that the face of it, chocolate cake certainly seems more scrumptious, but down the road, especially if we keep eating that cake, it's not good for us. The broccoli is not as sexy or yummy, but down the road, that broccoli is better for us and for our health, hard as it may be to choose the broccoli over the chocolate cake. Chocolate cake, fun and rewarding in the moment. Broccoli, better in the long term, but damn, that cake is tempting. So Campbell holds that this is the same process as we see in narcissistic relationships. So scrumptious at the face of it, the sexy in the short term are yummy. But unlike those people who are broccoli equivalents, maybe not so exciting, but in the long term, very good for us. And perhaps the world just divides us out as those who are chocolate cake and those who are broccoli, and I call broccoli. So interestingly, they tested this model, Campbell and his colleagues, in research. And they asked people about their former relationships. And the respondents were clear that it was the chocolate cake of it all that drew them to the narcissist, right? The sex appeal, the charm. Now, those who chose partners who were not narcissistic described them as nice. And it's sad that nice has such a bad brand. But over time, it was a different story. After that first blush, the adjective used to describe the narcissistic ex included self-centered, deceptive, and controlling, and that the relationship felt manipulative. With narcissistic people, relationship satisfaction plummeted from beginning to end. In the narcissistic relationships, and people really regretted the relationships. Interestingly, this wasn't the case with people who chose non-narcissistic partners. Obviously, there was a little bit of a drop in relationship satisfaction because the relationship ended. It was definitely not the crash that was observed from front to back of the relationship with the narcissistic partners. There was also a lot more regret, anger, and relief about the end of the relationship when people reflected on relationships with narcissistic partners. This wasn't observed in those who had relationships with non-narcissistic people. So I guess the question is, how do we make chocolate cake less alluring? And will broccoli ever have a chance against chocolate cake? Because the same question can be asked of narcissistic people. How do we make them less alluring in our minds? Will the nice people ever have a chance against them, particularly in the early phase of a relationship? I mean, it's a tough call, isn't it? Because at the level of our brain, if we're going to use chocolate cake as an example, sugar, fat, rich foods, they're rewarding. But chocolate cake also carries a message: celebration, fun, treat, birthday. So the question is whether narcissists are actually more rewarding at the level of our brains. Evolutionary theorists may be able to make the argument that the higher perceived status and attractiveness of the narcissist, They tend to be rated as more attractive. They put more time into their appearance. They have more money. They're more status conscious, so they portray more status. All of that would make them sort of primitively more enticing to us. But I would argue that we've evolved a little bit past our evolutionary demands of reproduction and survival. Our cerebral cortex is capable of being rational, and we're able to do things like put off childbearing, which goes against evolutionary pressure, to get ourselves educated or financially established. So we're not sort of little Darwin's bitches anymore. But there is also what we are told about narcissistic people, the messaging, whether it's in Disney princess movies or movies about love or the obsession we have recently, right? So many movies and series lately about narcissistic scammers, right? Or just that the egocentric people have a better ground game on Instagram. All of that sells the story that the traits associated with narcissism, charm, charisma, status, are appealing. And as long as people buy into that message, they're going to keep eating the chocolate cake. They're going to keep getting into relationships with narcissistic folks and keep thinking that they're going to be the exception to the rule and will be the one to meet the billionaire with a heart of gold. So nice is a predictor of relationship success because nice, which in official personality language is best known as agreeableness, is comprised of qualities like trust, being straightforward, altruism, cooperation, a willingness to follow the rules, empathy, and modesty. Now, fancy that, right? Now, as you can imagine, this is the stuff that makes a relationship last, and yet we tend to devalue these traits when we're dating, especially in men. Now, agreeableness is the opposite of antagonism. And antagonism is the stuff that makes up narcissism, and it includes manipulativeness, deceitfulness, callousness, and hostility. Which would you rather date? Now, most of you are sitting there, well, I'd rather date someone agreeable, but there's that damn chocolate cake. The antagonistic folks have the ability to lay on the charm and charisma long enough to get you. And then all of this antagonistic stuff, all that stuff that leads you to regret that big old piece of cake, leads you to regret the relationship. I don't know, maybe we just need to put icing on the broccoli, but then it wouldn't be as good for us, would it? Now, in my dreams, I would love for a world where agreeableness and kindness are put out there as what is desirable, rather than nice being just equated with the nice, boring person next door model, which is often considered to be unexciting. Nice actually is exciting. Unfortunately, we just conflate excitement with impulsivity and dysregulation. There's actually something really exciting about being loved and cherished in such a trusting and reciprocal way that over time, surrounded in that space of trust and safety, that we find our voice and our courage and perhaps take chances in our work and our aspirations because we know there is a loving and soft place to land. That sounds exciting as hell to me. The problem with movies and stories is that they frame relationship choices on short-term outcomes, sexiness and excitement and fun, where we should be making these choices on the basis of how they will impact our long-term health. Just as people don't smoke because it won't be good for their health in the long term, so too should we be avoiding toxic and antagonistic relationships for the same reason. So after I read and taught about Campbell's model about 15 years ago, I never looked at chocolate cake the same, or narcissists. The short-term zazazoo of the empty calories of the narcissistic relationship isn't worth it, and I say this as a woman who really loves cake. There is no piece of cake that tastes as good as a life without toxic relationships. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about narcissistic people being hangry, okay? So all of us know what this term hangry means, right? You get to be that sort of irritable, monstrous person when you're hungry. I am going to confess I'm a very hangry-esque person. If I get hungry, it's not pretty. Like I think that there is like a little hangry narcissist in me that comes out. And so I always keep something with me to eat, even if it's a foolish thing, because I just need to get through, and then I'm not so angry anymore. So not like I need a meal, I just need something, right? think a lot of us can resonate with that, and I don't think it's an uncommon reaction to having such a basic need, hunger, really, really bothering you at a given time. Just some of us become more irritable. But what's happening to a person when they're hangry, right? There's a need. There's a need that's in them. They're hungry. They need food. And so even the smallest things set them off. I was talking with someone recently and I recognized, I was trying to explain to them what was happening in their narcissistic relationship. They were having a lot of backing and forthing. They're saying, we actually had really long periods of it being good, like 6 months, 12 months, where people are like, this is a good relationship. I thought this was actually a decent relationship. Like, yeah, not always the most sensitive, deep person, but it was fine. And then the thing kind of went off the cliff and they couldn't understand why. When we broke it out, what we saw was when those shifts happened and their narcissistic relationship would really take a dark turn, was when this person, this happened to be an intimate relationship, was when this person wasn't being validated, when they didn't feel safe and secure and supplied and all those things. And I said it offhandedly. I'm like, oh, this, and I thought, oh, that's kind of clever. I said, that narcissistic person was just sort of psychologically hangry. And I want all of you to hold on to this metaphor because it's the off, on, up, down, happy, sad, black, white of these relationships that really sort of create the connective tissue of the trauma bond. You feel bad because you're like, well, we had a good weekend, so maybe this isn't bad. This has got to be me because I was laughing on Saturday and I'm sobbing now. Or we had a good year and now things aren't good. Maybe I'm the person who doesn't stick with people when the going gets tough. Maybe I'm the bad person. Maybe I'm disloyal, right? That's what a lot of you say as survivors or people stuck in these relationships. So I found, when I came up with it, when we talked about this sort of narcissistic hanger, I recognized that they, at those times when they're not supplied and they don't feel safe and secure and all of that, there's a hunger in them. And in their case, it's a hunger in their psyche. And they need to be supplied. They need to feel validated. They need to feel dominant. So what do? They go off on you or anyone else in their proximity that they can go off on. And they're like, "Arr!" And it's really awful because you'll say, but it was really good a few months ago. So some advice to you would be work backwards. If you were in a narcissistic relationship that had a lot of this sort of up and down pattern, think about those points where you felt it would turn. Like, this could happen over months and years. This could even happen over weeks that you notice these shifts. Because what you may find out, and you really do the deep dive, is that at those moments when things would turn was when they were getting more or less supply. So you might be having a rough run and then they get a big commission bonus at work. Or there might even be things you don't know about, which is what's tricky. Maybe they're flirting with someone at the gym, whatever it is. Now they're getting supply and they're a bit nicer. Then there's a shift down. Maybe they didn't get the promotion. Maybe things are really demanding at work and their boss is being mean to them. Maybe that person they were flirting with, that they sort of evaporated, or that person's boyfriend or girlfriend came in on the scene. Whatever it is, validation goes away and you come back into that hangry pattern. One thing that is so important to recognize in these narcissistic relationships is that there is some signal in the noise. There is some sense in these patterns that seem senseless. There's a fundamental truth. All of us do better on days when things are going well, by the way. We can't entirely throw the narcissistic folks under the bus on this one, right? So it's a day where you're having a good day and things are going well for you, whether it's work or home, or you feel, just stuff's good and somebody gives you a compliment. You're having a good day, right? And you might be a little bit more resilient on those days, a little bit more of the water off a duck's back kind of thing. Things may not get to you. You just may feel better in the world, and then people will notice a better version of you. But in people who are more psychologically healthy and have more flexible personalities, they can still keep themselves in check, or at least have enough self-awareness to say to someone, you know what, I'm not having a good day. Maybe I might opt out of doing something, or I might need to
I want to be more aware of how I'm approaching everyone because I may not be at my best today. Or be very aware of yourself and catch yourself and even say, I might need to step away. That's what self-awareness is. That is the key element of what is lacking in a narcissistic personality. They're not aware on those days when things aren't going as well for them. First of all, they feel like it's a coordinated attack by the world on them. They're the victim. Nothing is fair to them. Everyone is out to get them. So there's a real thin-skinned, hostile bias they're bringing into this, and their fists up. So it's everyone's fault that they're having a bad day. And they're not stopping to think on those days. So when a narcissistic person is sort of psychologically hangry, they don't stop to think how their hangry words are going to hurt other people. A self-aware person may still say things that aren't okay, but will pretty quickly try to make it right, give an appropriate apology, be aware that take responsibility for it, and then try to not let it happen again. The narcissistic person, they're just going to go off on people and will not take responsibility for that afterwards. Will not say, I was having a bad day, but that wasn't your problem. That's not going to happen. You might get a perfunctory, I'm sorry you feel that way, but that's not helping you feel better. So this idea of narcissistic people being hangry, it doesn't make it any easier to listen to their unempathic rants or their insults or their contempt or whatever it is they're doing that's hurting you and hurting your feelings. It's not that. But it can help you start seeing what the ups and downs are. That this is this need to sort of psychologically eat, as it were, to get supplied, to get the validation that allows them to stand up straight again. And if they're having a really good run, and they're feeling supplied every day, you might actually get weeks, months, and years, like I said, out of it. Years is less likely. They're still going to have little bumps in the road, but you can get some pretty long stretches. Narcissistic people are so sensitive that even a tiny bump in the road, somebody who might say something like offhandedly passive aggressive in a work meeting, might be enough to then send them into a funk. But the big ticket validation, if they're still getting that, they're at the top of the world in work. They're kind of, I don't know, they look the way they want. They have the car they want. They have the stuff they want. They have the status they want. That well-fed narcissistic person, honestly, might be one of the most seductive things you've ever experienced. A lot of you did during the love bombing phase. But use that hangry metaphor again to try to make sense of what's happening in your relationship, to lift the blame for you, because it ain't your job to fill them with supply. Healthy adult human beings are able to supply themselves. And on days when they may be feeling a little, healthy people might be feeling a little psychologically hangry, you figure out ways to find yourself something quick to eat and soothe yourself so you don't go off on other people. Narcissistic people don't have that. So when they're coming home hangry to you, or you're having to meet up with them hangry, it's a bad time at work. This happens with narcissistic bosses. When you're not hitting your sales totals, things aren't getting done, deadlines are being missed, they're not getting the validation because they may be getting in trouble from someone above them. Hangry boss, you know what that looks like. So whatever kind of narcissistic relationship you have, whether it's a parent or family member, a partner, or in the workplace, this hangry model really captures what happens to narcissistic people and why you see these ups and downs that don't make sense, but actually they make perfect sense when you have all the information and know what's going on in their life to help you connect the dots and hopefully lift some of the self-blame for you.
One of the big sort of takeaways from Gottman's work is this idea of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So if you're wondering how the four horsemen of the apocalypse and what they have to do with your relationship, keep watching because there's some real implications for people who are in narcissistic marriage. So let's take this on. This idea of Gottman's four horsemen of the apocalypse, very dramatic name, and the narcissistic relationship, because it does raise some issues that are specific in narcissistic marriages. Like I said, Dr. John Gottman is a renowned marital researcher who has studied thousands, probably tens of thousands of people who are married and coded these videos painstakingly to come to some major conclusions about what works in marriages. He trains thousands of therapists in his model of marital therapy. Maybe many of you have seen what's called a Gottman therapist. His data-driven approach to couples therapy is really, really steeped in science, and he has numerous adherents around the world, both therapists and clients. Gottman's research was done over many decades. And like I said, it's a really impressive body of work that has culminated in clinical applications that work for many, many people. Now, one of the big pieces to come out of, or big takeaways that's come out of Gottman's work, is he tries to understand sort of what predicts whether a marriage succeeds or doesn't stay together. And he brought out this idea, the concept of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And no, not the original four. So there's a trivia question. Any of you know what the four original horsemen of the apocalypse are? They are conquest, war, hunger, and death. Those are not what we're going to be talking about here. In Gottman's work, the four horsemen are factors that he identified by research that would predict the end of a relationship. And that if these patterns are not addressed, then the relationship, on the basis of his data, is not likely to last, and is very strongly predicted that such a marriage would end in divorce. So where it gets really interesting to me, as somebody who's interested in narcissistic relationships, is that all four of Gottman's horsemen, as they were, are actually perfect descriptors of what happens in all narcissistic relationships. So bear with me, because here is the reasoning. If Gottman's research holds that relationships characterized by these four patterns don't last, and just about every narcissistic relationship is characterized by these four patterns, then perhaps no narcissistic relationship can last. So let's take a look at what these four horsemen are, so you could apply them to your relationships and think about what this really means. So let's start by talking about the four horsemen. The four horsemen are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. In fact, these factors pretty much describe narcissistic communication styles with everyone. So let's start with criticism. Criticism is just what it sounds like. Criticism. Now remember, Gottman's work is focused on marriage and intimate relationships, and I think his work is very much focused on marriage and divorce, but marriage. And specifically, though, his model is very focused on communication within marital relationships. So Gottman is basically observing how people talk to each other in an intimate relationship, in a marital relationship. And that's what his research is based on. The way they describe criticism in the Gottman model is that criticism is, in essence, going after someone's character. For example, in a relationship, if one person feels, I don't know, the other person's not doing their share of the chores, a criticism statement would be, "You're so lazy. What do you do all day? You don't get anything done. You never have." So that's criticism. It doesn't actually address the specific issue of the dishes are not done, okay? It doesn't feel good to be on the receiving end of that. And again, the focus isn't even on the undone dishes. It's about assailing the other person. And let's face it, criticism is pretty much the core of almost every narcissistic relationship. They'll say things like, "You never cared about me," instead of, "I had hoped you would call more often." Criticism is a chronic refrain of the narcissistic relationship. And then once you hear it for long enough, what ends up happening is the person always being criticized is at some point you start believing it. Defensiveness, horseman 2, is actually often a cycle that plays out for both people in a narcissistic relationship. Mostly because there is so much criticism. So in Gottman's model, criticism sets off defensiveness. When we feel attacked, we want to defend ourselves. It's an almost reflexive reaction, which is why it's so hard in narcissistic relationships, right? I tell you don't defend, you're like, "Oh, they're criticizing me, I want to defend." But with narcissists, defensiveness always makes things worse. Narcissists do this all the time, and it can often take the form of gaslighting. "I never said that. I never did that. That didn't happen." Or sometimes they try word salad. I am tired of being told I don't care. I work hard. I make money. I plan vacations. I have stopped playing tennis as much, and I love tennis, and now I'm not playing tennis. It's like nobody in this family cares about my health. I was doing one thing for my health. I was playing tennis. And then, if I play tennis, there's not going to be any money. And you're like, what just happened, right? Meanwhile, that entire word salad mess may have simply been launched by you asking them why they didn't pick up the milk and cat food on the way home because you needed it for that night. Narcissistic relationships are basically just defensive dances. You trying to, usually failing, but you defending yourself from accusations that often don't make sense or just never end, or criticisms that seem unrelenting, and them, the narcissist, constantly defending themselves to protect their fragility. Then there is horseman number 3, contempt. Contempt, very simply, is just being mean, but not just regular mean, dismissively, sneeringly mean. A person who shows contempt is almost disgusted by someone. Anyone in a narcissistic relationship has pretty much just experienced a masterclass on contempt. Narcissists get bored with people pretty easily. Narcissists are also often quite snobby. They can be dismissive and invalidating. And all of these things present as contempt. They may have contempt for your friends or your family. They may have contempt for the way you cook. They may have contempt for how you sneeze. Nothing is off limits. Contempt is about a sense of superiority, that somehow one person is doing more, is worth more, deserves more, and is somehow better than the other person. And needless to say, in the case of the narcissist, it's always that they think they deserve more. Contempt is also, though, a troubling two-way street in a narcissistic relationship. And it makes sense why this is the case. The narcissist often tends to be contemptuous of lots of people, including of their own partner. But since contempt can arise from the negative feelings that you have about a partner, you yourself, if you're in a narcissistic relationship, may find yourself developing contempt. And then you start feeling like you're the one who's narcissistic because you're having such negative, contemptuous feelings. Interestingly, Gottman found that contempt was the most consistent predictor of divorce. Then there is the next horseman, which is good old stonewalling. Stonewalling is a narcissist's go-to. Stonewalling can be things like, I refuse to talk about that, storming out of or leaving the room while you're speaking directly to them, the silent treatment, looking at their phone when you are talking. All of those are forms of stonewalling. Again, Gottman's assertion is that we are all guilty of doing these things at times. You yourself may have stonewalled too. I know I've stonewalled. I'm copping to it. We've probably all done it. And his argument actually about stonewalling is that when we are physiologically flooded, we don't respond and we shut down. And that's what he's giving as the reasoning behind stonewalling. Now, the nice thing is that Gottman's model doesn't just leave us hanging. His institute actually suggests antidotes to these patterns. But many of the things that he suggests as the antidotes do not work in a narcissistic relationship. They suggest that the antidote to criticism, for example, is to talk about your feelings with sentences that start with I, and to express a need positively. Sadly, I know this is something that many people were told when they went to couples therapy with a narcissistic partner. I tell people this, that you've got to take accountability, that you have to put feelings in terms of I. And when they used that technique with the narcissist, they were only met with contempt when they tried this. Can you imagine saying to a narcissist, I feel a little anxious and I just want to talk to you about my day? An antidote that they suggest to contempt is to build a culture of appreciation and reminding yourself of your partner's positive attributes. The difficult thing is that to do this, to create that culture of cooperation and ultra appreciating your partner when they're narcissistic, is that it can often run the risk of justification, of maintaining cognitive dissonance, and strengthening the trauma bond. Again, this is guidance that many people in narcissistic relationships are given in couples therapy. Build gratitude for your partner. I have no doubt it works well when there are two non-antagonistic people in a relationship, and many times we get sloppy when we're in our relationships and we don't express enough gratitude. The idea of one person only expressing the gratitude, you, to the narcissist, over time isn't going to work. As an antidote to defensiveness, they suggest taking responsibility, which in their language means accepting your partner's point of view and apologizing for your wrongdoing. Once again, you can see how this antidote gets tricky, because if the narcissist's point of view is deeply skewed or self-serving, which tends to happen quite a bit in narcissistic relationships, what are you doing then when you accept their point of view again, in essence, kind of sign off on gaslighting at times, and concerns, and this sort of raises, again, to me, concerns about cognitive dissonance. Now, I am always going to be the first to say, take responsibility and own your behavior. No one is always going to get it right in a relationship. Just own it. But that technique only works if both parties in a relationship are doing it. Now, as the antidote to stonewalling, the people in this model, they suggest self-soothing, like taking a break. Now, the taking a break, the sort of getting yourself out of that situation, the issue is that that's meant for the stonewaller, not for the stonewall-e. Now, perhaps the narcissist will do this, and if your temptation is to march off, then there is some utility in this, right? But if the narcissist is the one who keeps stonewalling, they are unlikely to hear you when you point this pattern out to them. Now, I am actually, again, I am an admirer of the body of research that Gottman has produced and how it's gotten translated into clinical intervention. But, this is a big but, in the skewed and contorted world of narcissistic relationships, this guidance not only would leave many people in narcissistic relationships with no meaningful results or recourse or safety, it could actually make the abuse worse. The narcissist saying, hey, you don't express yourself positively enough. Isn't that what we just learned in therapy? Or you don't appreciate me enough. That's what we were told. Or you need to apologize to me. And the fact is that, and I read their materials carefully, at Gottman's Institute, they are definitely willing to recognize that some relationships are too toxic to save. And they do cite narcissistic personality disorder as one of the factors in that. But the challenge remains that because many, many therapists may not detect narcissism or narcissistic personality styles and patterns, they may just happily be suggesting antidotes and gratitude when the utility of that ship has left the harbor. Given that the majority of narcissistic relationships are characterized by these patterns, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, and sometimes these patterns are observed by both partners, and the antidotes being suggested for each of these patterns pretty much not working, then the unfortunate conclusion is that these relationships just really don't work, at least not in a healthy way. And it's tough to be a couples therapist, especially if you're using this model to be able to say, yeah, we're not going to be able to fix the car, we're not going to be able to fix the marriage. And this breakdown may explain some of the frustrations you experienced in couples therapy, because many models of couples therapy do not make sufficient allowances for unhealthy patterns like narcissism. And so when I read these materials, I was like, this is interesting. I've always known about the four horsemen model. And so when I noticed contempt in marital relationships, I'm like, yikes. But because so often the contempt, because of the nature of the work I do, the contempt in a marital relationship, that there's really no way of creating sort of a culture of appreciation or any of these other tools, you really do realize that it's not going to work. And sometimes clients will say that we've gone to couples therapy and it actually did make things far, far worse in the relationship, because the non-narcissistic partner was being told, you need to try to take their point of view, you need to express more gratitude. So do a deep dive on your relationship and go ahead and reflect, how many of the four horsemen do you have in your relationship? And although Gottman's research is focused on marriage, I do think that these constructs, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, these are unhealthy elements of any relationship. And you may say, it's interesting, I have a friend who's narcissistic, I have a boss who's narcissistic, I have a parent or a sibling who's narcissistic, and it's exactly the same kind of things that are happening. These patterns are manifesting in those relationships. So the very thing that pretty much speaks to what is likely the end of a relationship are some of the core characteristics of a narcissistic relationship. Now that's something to chew on. Thanks again for tuning in.